Education opens doors for the gospel, bringing hope to dark places and sparking lasting change around the world. At Teach Beyond, we're reaching the nations through education.
This is Transformed and Transformational, a podcast from Teach Beyond. I'm Kian.
And I'm Heather. We're exploring how the gospel transforms us and overflows to impact classrooms, communities, and the world.
Let's jump into today's conversation. I am excited for our conversation today. We are talking with Dr. Erik Carter, who is the Executive Director of the Baylor Center on Disability and Flourishing in the School of Education. And as we talk about this, I'm thinking of some of my friends who have children with disabilities and just the impact this has on entire families when they find a community that is both open and welcoming to them.
Yeah, that's so true. I think the 10 dimensions of belonging that we're talking through today are so helpful to think about this from different angles. And it's so applicable for classrooms, neighborhoods, churches, the various different spheres where we find ourselves.
Erik is the Luther Sweet Endowed Chair of Disabilities at Baylor University in Texas. He has a bachelor's degree in Christian education from Wheaton College in Illinois and master's and doctoral degrees in special education from Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. His work focuses on faith and disability, specifically with children and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Let's go over to the conversation with Erik now. Welcome to the podcast, Erik.
It's great to be with you both. Thank you.
Hi, Erik. We are so excited to have you here. We're excited to dive into this conversation. And as we get started to talk about disability and what that might mean for us in a community, in churches, in schools, I'm curious to hear what first led you to the study of the field of special education.
Well, I actually stumbled into this field. I think, like so many people still today, I grew up in a world that really didn't include people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We were in separate classrooms, separate schools, separate communities. And so our lives really rarely intersected. So it wasn't until actually the freshman year of college when I ended up developing some friendships with some other 18 and 19-year-olds with developmental disabilities and was just captivated by the friendships that we formed. Enjoyed so much the time we spent together, the ways we came to know one another. But through that, those friendships also just became really enamored by the wonderful, beautiful, deep faith of these young men and women with disabilities. And so through those encounters, I discovered the gift of friendship, and I also discovered the gift of faith through them as well. So that sort of set me on a course for all these years later, thinking, how do I help other young people stumble into the lives of people with disabilities whom they might not otherwise encounter or pursue, and to be perhaps transformed by those encounters.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thinking, not everyone formally studies this
Sure.
field, but certainly we are interacting in life in this realm. And so I'm curious, as we're getting started, what you wish people knew about the field of special education, about faith and disability, who didn't actually study that and might not come in with that body of knowledge.
Right. Well, I think just one is wanting people to know just how present people with disabilities, kids, youth, adults are in all of our communities, wherever we are in the world. Something like 1 in 6 kids lives in some way with a disability that impacts their learning or relationship. So disability is among us. And when we think about our schools and our congregations, we want to make sure that kids with disabilities are also with us as well. I wish that people knew that special education isn't just a field. It's really a form of ministry. It's this calling rooted in this belief that every single person is created in the image of God with dignity and worth and gifts to share. And part of what we're doing as special educators is helping others encounter those gifts and those contributions and those strengths and all the things that might enrich and enliven our communities. But I think I want people to know just how impactful a field this can be, that when we think carefully about how we provide instruction and design supports and offer this strong special education, how much it changes kids' learning and their relationships and their long-term trajectories. So when we do this work well, when we widen who we welcome into our classrooms and congregations and teach with the very best tools, it's transformative for kids with disabilities, but
Mm.
it's also transformative for the rest of the community because it ends up shaping everyone else's expectations and
Yeah.
aspirations and perspectives of those who come to know these kids. And so I think just understanding the ripple effect of doing this well, not just on kids and their families, but on our whole communities that are learning to welcome and embrace this segment of their community.
Hmm. I like the focus on the fact that it's impacting so many people. It impacts the immediate students, but then the students around those students and their families and their communities is so important. As we're talking, so you discussed how it's a calling, and one of the things you talk about is the intersection of faith and disability. I'm curious what that means. What part of faith and what part of disability are intersecting? What that might mean for somebody to think about it for the first time.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think faith and disability aren't separate spheres. I think that's really why we put those together. Because if you talk to young people with disabilities or their families, what you realize is how central their faith is to their identity and sense of meaning and purpose and community. Disability doesn't diminish faith; it can often deepen faith. And so we want everyone to know that faith matters in the lives of people with disabilities and their families, just like it matters in the lives of anyone else. But I think also as a Christian, our faith shapes how we see people with disabilities, not as people who are broken or challenged or who have deficits or deficiencies or in all those things that come to mind when the world thinks about disability, but as people who are gifted and image bearers and wonderfully made and beloved. And so I think our perspective, a faithful perspective on disability, comes to see people with disabilities in a very different light. And I think also, our faith shapes the kinds of communities that we're striving to create. When I think about the picture of the body of Christ in First Corinthians, of every member mattering just as much as every other member, as every gift being needed, I also think about that as a call on Christian communities to widen the welcome in ways that receive the
Mm.
gifts of people with disabilities and their
Mm.
presence.
Mm.
So I think it shapes actually how we think about community as a whole. And then certainly it shapes how we approach our work, that in working with kids with disabilities who often require much more intensive support and long-term supports and intensive instruction, it calls us to a posture of patience and kindness and gentleness and all of those things that shapes the spirit of how we work with people with disabilities, in a spirit marked by love and embrace. And so all of those things come together. For us as a center, it means that we want to know and understand the important place of faith in the lives of people with disabilities and their families, and how to open up communities that allow them to grow and deepen in their faith and share their faith with others. So all of those are part of this big intersection of faith and disability, that sort of is really at the core of our work as a center on disability and flourishing.
Yeah, yeah. Just chiming in here that
Sure.
when we use the term disability, there really is such a wide spectrum of different types of disabilities, right? Some are visible, some are not, some are, you focused more on intellectual disability, but there's all different types of disability. And we want to honor the fact that there are many different types of ways that this plays out, whether it's in the classroom or the community. It could be literally access to a sidewalk, or it could be learning needs, or it could, various different aspects.
Heather, that's a really important point, just to think about the incredible rich diversity of people who
Mhm.
experience disability in all those different ways. And um, it is unusual to sort of think about a single word that would capture that diversity of
Yeah.
individuals. And it's kind of a modern word that actually is we use to do that. But what is common to all of those experiences is that whatever the form of disability is, people encounter barriers to
Mm.
being part of the communities and relationships that are important to them. And that is what ties the experience of a student with Down syndrome, or a young adult who's had an accident or a traumatic brain injury, or someone who's a disability related to aging or dementia.
Mhm.
All of
Mhm.
those evoke barriers to participation, and sometimes still stigma in terms of how
Yeah.
they're viewed
Yeah.
and perceived. And that's what I think, back to that prior question, our faith calls us to respond differently, to be barrier breakers
Yeah.
and diminishers of stigma.
I'm thinking, even as I'm about to ask this question, if this is a self-selecting question or not. But somebody who I would look around and say, there's not a lot of people around me with serious disabilities, like serious kind of those disability and those needs. And I'm wondering maybe that's my own fault, like the people kind of I've surrounded in my community, or maybe that's just where I am right now. And so, what do you say to somebody who looks around and says, like, that's not in my immediate world? What encouragement do you have to them? What do you have to kind of share with them to maybe get involved or pay attention to that more?
Well, I opened up, I think, even with that example of growing up in a world where I never encountered disability. And part of it is depending on the communities or countries that we live in, disability is sometimes more hidden, more on the peripheries, more kept from being at the center of community because of those barriers of architecture or attitude or awareness. So I think the more likely answer is that it's in our midst in terms of being present in our communities, but just in hidden corners. Heather, you mentioned most disabilities are actually invisible. They're not apparent at first glance, and so that's another reason is sort of in our midst are people who might be experiencing disabilities that aren't readily apparent to us, but still may require additional support or consideration in those areas. It's interesting, the statistics. I'll use the example in the United States, and then we can extrapolate to around the world. But 1 in 3 families has at least one member that has identifies as having a disability of some kind. We see that over and over in our census data, and it comes out to about 1 in 4 adults. Those numbers actually
Mm,
hold up all around the world, although
mm,
again, what we consider to be a disabling condition varies,
yeah.
determines based on our expectations, based on the communities that we're in as well. So I think the short answer is disability is a natural part of the human experience, and if we're not encountering people with disabilities, we might want to think about broadening who we think about as our neighbor and who with whom we pursue relationships, because it can seem hidden or other in so many ways.
Yeah, that's good. Well, Eric, I'm known around here for practical, what can we actually do with the information that we're looking at? And so, I would love to know some practical ways that we can create inclusive communities, classrooms, the spheres that we're in. And you have 10 dimensions of belonging. I'd love it if we could walk through those, learn more about kind of these practical ways that this might play out in our communities.
Sure, Heather. Yeah, we are enamored with the idea of belonging, and we should be
Mm,
theologically. I think
mm,
going back to that image of 1 Corinthians 12, or even the parable of the great banquet of
mhm,
belonging around God's table, it calls us to think maybe beyond just integrating people or just including people, something more than just sharing space, but actually sharing lives and coming to see one another differently. So at our center and in our work, we often talk about creating communities of belonging. Uh, and when we take that question back to kids with disabilities and their families of what does belonging look like for you in the communities that matter most to you, whether that's your classroom or a club or your church or your neighborhood, when we pose that question of what does belonging mean to you, 10 themes emerge over and over and over. These are the 10. Belonging is to be present and to be invited, it's to be welcomed and known, to be accepted and supported, it's to be heard. And then the relational components, it's to be befriended, to be needed, and to be loved.
mm,
And we could talk about each one of those because there's really they're really almost postures of communities. Are we a community that is ensuring people can be present, that's inviting widely, that's welcoming well, that's coming to know people in terms of their strengths and gifts and contributions,
mhm,
that's
mhm.
accepting people without condition or caveat, that's supporting people to be part of all the experiences and relationships that are part of your community. But then also, are we listening to what matters to
Mhm.
individuals? Are they being heard and not making assumptions about them, but asking what matters most for them?
Yeah.
And then those areas of thinking about how friendship is so tied to this experience of belonging, to be picked back by someone else as a
Yeah.
friend.
Yeah.
And then as your gifts are learned about and encountered, you come to be needed, and those gifts are used and deployed in all kinds of ways. And of course, all of that is wrapped in a call to love one another deeply. So we love that framework of belonging because it has lots of practical steps that can be embedded within it, and but also because it's actually a way of thinking about belonging for anyone. Actually, it's just that these 10
Mm,
dimensions of belonging are not guaranteed,
mm,
often uncertain, usually elusive
yeah,
for people with disabilities and their
yeah.
families. So we want to be especially attentive to their presence and their absence.
Hmm. These are great, and there's a lot to go through, obviously,
Sure.
as you said. And I would love to work our way through them. So you
Yeah.
start with presence, and in earlier you mentioned kind of offhandedly architecture as being an
Yeah.
important thing, and I was like, I wonder what you mean by that. I wonder all the different implications that has. So does architecture come into being present, being
Yeah.
able to be involved in the community, or
Well,
any? What does that mean? Yeah.
yeah, it's an odd one to start with because I think most of us don't think about, well, I need to be there to experience belonging, but actually being there is a major challenge for many people with disabilities. There's so many barriers that prevent kids from being in the same classrooms or cafeterias or after school jobs or community programs as their peers without disabilities. So this notion of being present requires reflecting on the barriers that keep people from sharing space with others, their peers. Architecture is one. Sometimes we've built our buildings in ways that certain kids can't get in. Kids with mobility impairments or other or spaces that have high sensory input and intensity are really hard for kids with who might be autistic to be part of those experiences. Sometimes, if you can't navigate the spaces, if your classroom's on the second floor without stairs, or you've got a curriculum that some kids just can't access, all of those are barriers to being present for kids with disabilities. So that's really the first step, is just reflecting on who do I know is in my community but isn't part of this program or activity or school, and what is it that's standing in the way of that happening.
Mm,
That helps
mm.
us make sure people can be present.
Such a good point that if we don't attend to this particular point, then the rest might seem like, well, everything's going fine because actually they're not even there in the
Right.
conversation or at the table, so to speak. And so uh it might seem like, oh, things are running smoothly, but wow, we've missed a portion of the population if they're not physically there or able to be there in any way.
Yeah. We usually say it belonging begins with presence for that reason. And
Yeah.
while most of us can assume that we can be present in the places that we want to be part of, that assumption doesn't carry forward for some kids with disabilities,
Yeah. Yeah.
which of course then jumps us to the antidote to absence, which is that second dimension of being invited.
Yeah.
So if
Yeah.
people aren't present, how do we begin to pursue people
Uh-huh.
who aren't there?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that's a unique thing we're called to as Christians. Is I mean, it too is the parable of the great banquet, of going to the highways and byways and saying, who isn't here? And to say, we need you here. It wouldn't be the same without you.
Mhm.
And that would be extraordinary for Christian schools and churches to be on the forefront of inviting people with
Mhm.
disabilities when so much of the world steps away and won't step into that space.
Mhm. Mhm. How have you seen the inviting and then what follows with welcoming these two? How have you seen that done well in a
Yeah.
school, in a church? Like, what does that look like practically?
Well, and part of it is anticipating who might show up,
Mhm.
anticipating who resides in your community that might arrive, and anticipating that arrival by making sure the supports are in place. That we've designed programs and experiences with the full breadth of our community in mind. So I think there's a sense of proactiveness.
Mhm.
That makes someone feel welcomed. Like, we're not surprised when you come.
Yeah.
We expected you would be here, and we're ready to welcome you, to greet you, to engage with you. So I think that's an element of it. The interesting thing about being welcomed, as we take this question back to students and their families, is they often talk about the ordinary gestures rather than
Huh.
extraordinary
Huh.
things. Welcoming when I arrive, asking my name, introducing me to others, saving me a seat, noticing when I don't come, and checking in to follow up on
Yeah.
why I wasn't there. It's actually ordinary gestures that everyone actually knows how to do, but we get reluctant to do that when disability is part of the equation. We worry we'll say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. And that sense of like, I don't want to do it poorly leads us to not do anything at all. So in many ways, it's just empowering people to think, what would anyone find welcoming? Let's make sure we're doing those things for kids with disabilities. And then there may be some additional things that we're going to want to learn that makes John feel welcomed, or Sam feel welcomed, or Anita feel welcomed.
I like planning them for them to come, because I know I worked at a restaurant. It's like when somebody shows up, and you're like, oh, we have that special menu, but it's in the back and we don't know where it is, and it's going to take us 10 minutes to get it. It's not actually helpful anymore. You kind of are welcoming, but not really. And then you mentioned, what would John like? What would these people like as you get to know them? So that's the next step, is known. So what does that mean after you've welcomed them in the door? You've welcomed them. What's the step known? What does that look like?
Well, I mean, it's in some of the ways you just referenced. It's knowing people by name. It's knowing the things that are important to them, knowing a bit of their story. All of those things lead you to feel like you belong. And it happens over time. That unfolds. But it might mean that there's some questions we ask at the outset of, what would it look like for us to support you well in our classrooms or in our school? What can we do to support your family to flourish all 7 days of the week? So asking good questions is a really good way to come to know people. What would participation look like for you? What supports make the most difference for you? How could we make Sunday morning the best day of the week for your child? But there's another aspect of this, is it's not just whether you're known, but how you're known. And I think so often in our world, kids with disabilities are known by their deficits, by their challenges, by what they can't do or what they struggle to do. And so is there a fuller way? It's important to know those things, but what if we knew kids' strengths and talents and passions and interests, and more about their character and all of the things that that actually could be points of connection to community, rather than things that separate them from community? So what we heard in our research in this area is people want to be known for their strengths, and not merely in a narrow way that flattens their portrait just in terms of what they can't do. Because if that's all you know about someone with a disability, it becomes really hard to imagine a place in your community for someone only based on what they can't do or struggle to do.
As you, it comes right after welcomed.
Yeah.
So somebody comes into your space, you welcome them. What does knowing about them look like, as far as, I mean, I don't know. You don't want to meet somebody new and say like, okay, tell me. I don't know. How deep of a question can you ask?
Well, in our schools, we have planning processes, right? Often we recommend a individualized planning that helps us come to know this particular kid. We talk about their strengths and needs and interests and goals, and that becomes a starting point for conversations for coming to know them well. And we've asked thoughtful questions. We have some guides that we're glad to share out that kind of give some conversation starters. But I think in a more general way, it's just about spending time together over time. And that's how you come to know someone. And then as you discover, wow, Sam's really good at these things. Let's look for our opportunities for Sam to do those things in more widespread ways. I get to know, wow, Sarah, the way she communicates, not through speaking, but through her communication device or other ways. Now I can help introduce her to others and help them learn how to communicate well with her. So becoming known certainly has questions you might ask, but it also just sort of unfolds over time from attending to someone and being present with them.
Let's take a short break for a story from the field.
My name is Hakim Sentamu. I am from Uganda, and I am the lead facilitator at Sparrow Project Uganda. To me, education has meant that tool that brings about transformation and potential to communities. And this is why Sparrow Project is important, because it is reaching out to far-to-reach areas, to places where people do not have access to proper education.
My name is Annette Kabuye, one of the Sparrow Facilitator volunteers. There are many challenges involved with getting an education in Uganda. Many teachers serve faithfully in schools, but they lack the full training in how to best teach their students. These teachers tend to end up in the rural areas of Uganda, and this is the area where we find the underserved communities. And so this is where the Sparrow Project comes in, to equip those teachers with the education that they need to better serve their students, and then in turn the communities as well.
It's important to train Ugandan teachers in Sparrow Project curriculum because it serves two aspects. It serves the academic side and also serves on the faith aspect, which is very important as far as transformation is concerned.
What I enjoy about teaching is discipleship. To see the students' character change and grow in their mindset.
The guiding principle behind Sparrow Project is the biblical worldview, where we do not just talk about things, but we talk about them referring to the Word of God and the truth in the Bible. And this makes this curriculum very, very important to these communities.
For our weekly spotlight, we are focusing on Grace International School in Chiang Mai, Thailand. If you want to learn more about opportunities to serve, visit the Teach Beyond Opportunity Board at teachbeyond.org/go.
Now back to our conversation. So you mentioned thoughtful questions, and that actually sounds really helpful. And I'm just curious if there's like, hey, here's one question you can ask somebody that's like a good, thoughtfully phrased question. Here's what I'm going to give you to like start with. And then you probably read the entire document to get more questions. But you have something you could give somebody as just a first question that you can have in your pocket. If you
Yeah.
need it.
You know, when I think about sort of our school planning, for example, it's often what supports could we provide that help you be part of this place in the ways that matter most for you? Or we're asking parents not what are the challenges, what are the struggles, but what are the things. What are the things that are awesome about your child? What are the things that people compliment your child about? Those are ways that invite actually a very different reaction from parents who are used to people asking about all the ways their child falls short or struggles or is different. So to say, where does your kid shine, and what supports would we need to help her to shine in those ways? That's a beautiful question that leads you to connection and inclusion rather than to separation and exclusion. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly this progression. Now, it takes a lot of time to be known.
Yeah.
And then right after that, you have accepted
Yeah.
and supported. And so we're shifting into a deeper dimension with
Sure.
each of these, right? And so, what does it look like in the accepted and supported dimensions?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the acceptance sometimes comes with the kinds of education and training we might provide to a community that's never met someone with Down syndrome or is
Mhm.
autistic or has complex communication needs, might need to learn a bit more about those experiences and how best to support them and the ways they might contribute. So I think there's an element of education that can be part of acceptance as well. We have congregations that do kind of disability awareness events or programs or things like that. And those can be really valuable as well. I think the other thing is that we model that acceptance. So we model how you interact with and welcome and include a child and value them and connect them to learning opportunities, and other kids start to follow suit because they see that being modeled. But ultimately, I think the acceptance comes through coming to get to know people personally. You know, you can learn about someone, but when you get to know Sam and his peculiarities and his passions and his hobbies and the things he loves to talk about, and then you start to see the connections between your experiences and others. So we don't want acceptance to be merely like an informational campaign. We also want to get people in relationship with one another, which is where acceptance is actually really formed. I think through that process, that's how you also learn what supports a person needs to be part of all these experiences, what encouragement, what accommodations, what learning adaptations are needed. And as you begin to implement those, then you're demonstrating that acceptance. Supports is what makes participation possible. And it's what demonstrates that commitment to wanting a kid to be part of this community.
How would you say that's distinct from the next one, heard? So supported and heard, like where's the line of shifting from one to the other? Because these are all like just 1 degree different, but you can
Yeah.
see that okay, we're going to a new dimension here. So what shifts us into the heard?
Yeah, there's a bit of a depth and overlap as we go
Sure.
further.
Yeah.
I think this has come out because so often people with disabilities, developmental disabilities in particular, aren't often asked what they think. They're often presumptions are made, assumptions are made, and decisions are made for them without them. And so, in many ways, this is just a reminder that, there's something about having your perspective sought out, about being asked what you think, about having a seat at the table, about knowing that your voice matters, that leads to that experience of belonging. It's also through being heard that you do come to be known, and it's the pathway to support. So these do go alongside one another. But I think in many ways it comes out of a history where instead of hearing from people with disabilities, we hear from their parents, or we hear from their teachers, or we ask questions about them without them. And that's the mantra in the disability community: is nothing about us without us. And so it's a reminder that,
Mm.
wow, there's incredible perspectives that sometimes we overlook, that may take more time to pull out because someone doesn't communicate in traditional ways, or and so it requires a little bit more work to truly hear them, but it's no less important to do so.
That is so important. That's really good. As we're kind of getting to the last three, you group them together as the relational dimension. Can you talk to us about what those three look like? Befriended, needed, and loved.
Yeah. Well, I think in a world that's epidemic with loneliness and isolation, we know how good it feels to be picked back as a friend. That reciprocity of a deep relationship where people come to know you and accept you, and are excited to see you and miss you when you're not there, are also at the core of belonging. And yet, what we find is so many people with kids with developmental disabilities have helpers, have tutors, have buddies, but very few friends. And so that even reciprocal relationship, not of a hierarchy, but of a co-equals in that sense, doesn't happen automatically. Particularly if we surround kids with adult supports, we crowd out peers in that process. So that sense of being befriended is just so important for any child, regardless, but so elusive for many kids with disabilities. I think the needed part also comes from a posture that we have of thinking about ministry to people with disabilities, and rarely ministry by people with disabilities, or service to people with disabilities rather than service by people with disabilities. And if we come to know kids with disabilities as having gifts that other people need, that changes how they're seen in the community. And I think that's a real posture change. So we're looking for opportunities for kids to volunteer, to work on a group project, to have a role on a team, to be on student government, whatever the different experiences are that have them a chance to develop and share those gifts with others is really important. And then love, we mentioned because it almost never comes up in educational conversations. We talk about practices, we talk about policies, and we miss the importance of love, because love is the thing that leads you to invite and to welcome and to know and support and befriend, even when it takes work and it takes time. And if you're in a community where love abounds, you're quite likely to talk about experiencing belonging in that community too. So, um, I've talked about them as if they're ordered, but they're not really. They all go together, and it's so hard to have one without the other. And so there is a deepening progression there. It's really hard to experience belonging if you just don't have the relationships that mark a community. And I think what we find is that for many kids with disabilities, they have lots of services, they have lots of supports, but they have few relationships, and that's where the church can shine. We know how to forge relationships, and disability doesn't change that. It should just require us to be doubly intentional about our efforts in that area.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm thinking about for parents, caregivers, teachers, people who are facilitating community for children. How can they intentionally help all the children to see each other and be inclusive of each other in the ways that that looks like in that community?
Yeah, I think modeling it first matters. Kids
Mm.
watch how we talk about others and who we invite into our lives, and how we respond to difference. So I think in many ways that inclusion begins with what we embody, and not just what we explain in that sense. I think talking, like sort of just normalizing in many ways the diversity of people in our midst, to talk openly about differences in ability and communication and learning and movement, not as something strange, but actually as something natural and beautiful in God's design. And I think also there's power in stories, and thinking about the books and shows and conversations that we have that maybe introduce kids with disabilities in different ways as whole and complex people, as neighbors and friends, and not just as heroes or as tragedies that so often is. So I think there's just a lot of that kind of modeling and having conversations, but most of all, including. You can't learn to do this well from a distance. You have to step into it and experience this and wrestle through it and all of its challenges. Belonging isn't easy. It's a complex, challenging thing to do, but we're called to do it. And so for families and teachers to step into that space and offer those kinds of teaching and learning opportunities is really, really critical.
What would you say for someone for whom this is a newer thought, or, oh, I want to pay more attention to these dimensions and which ones am I doing and which ones am I not maybe paying attention to right now? What would be a next step to for them today?
Yeah, I love the idea of using this framework as a point of reflection together as a community. So, getting together with other teachers in your school or others in your congregation and posing the questions together in each of those 10 areas. What are we doing really well right now that we want to keep doing? What could we do better or different to open up the
Mhm.
experience of belonging in this area to others? And what should we prioritize next? What is the call on us right now, next in the midst? And doing that with others helps rounds out our own insecurities about
Yeah,
doing this, our
yeah,
own vulnerability about not knowing what to do or not doing it well or not doing it with excellence, all the fears that we have. So I
right.
think that kind of reflection together with others, I'm convinced that we have the capacity and knowledge to do this in our communities, but it sure feels a lot on our own. So how do we get
Mhm.
together with others who maybe are a little further along, who have personal connection to disability, to help us figure out our next steps in this space?
I wonder if you have any stories about a community coming together and kind of intentionally making these changes, moving into this space, this posture of more welcoming.
Yeah.
A story about like a community or a person who's been impacted by that.
Yeah, I think actually not about a faith-based community, but the university that I just came from a couple years ago was one of 350 universities around the United States that started college programs for students with intellectual disability. That might blow people's mind. The notion that people with Down syndrome might attend college. So we had a program called Next Steps at Vanderbilt. It opened up the doors for 38 students with intellectual disability who flourished because of the raised expectations, the opportunity to audit classes and work on campus and get to know their peers and be part of clubs and others. So the students who were part of that flourished. But the part I always love to share is the transformation wasn't one sided. Hundreds of Vanderbilt undergraduates served as mentors and peers, took classes together, grabbed lunch, studies together, worshiped in community. And over, they would say, I thought I was here to help, but I'm the one who's been changed. They will go and lead communities differently because they lived and learned alongside people with intellectual disability. And I think that in some way, I think that's in some ways, even though it was a secular university, it's the gospel lived out that the world, those who the world so often overlooks, are the ones who lead us back to what matters most, and that this sense of experience of belonging is a mutual benefit. We all flourish when those who we presume are less capable or less valuable are actually centered in our communities. So we're seeing that over and over, not just in college campuses, but in schools and especially in churches that learn to receive the gifts and faith and friendship of people who are absolutely indispensable within the body of Christ.
That's good. It's a powerful story to hear how it impacts so many. The ripple effects are
Yeah,
huge, and
yeah,
they keep growing, and you don't know how far they go for years and years.
Mhm, mhm.
Thank you, Eric, for joining
sure.
us. Thank you for having this conversation. Before we let you go, we have a final question we like to ask everyone, and that's what is one thing that's changed in your life? So this can be something really big and dramatic. This can be something small that has been changing your life the last week. But you're free to go with it where you want. I'll go first, so you have a little bit of time to think about it. Then Heather will go, then you get to go last. So hopefully that'll help you. The thing that's changing my life is this is very much work related, but I manage a ton of websites for Teach Beyond, and so we got some new software that's making it a lot easier. So it's
Nice.
a little program that's just changing a task I do every day to make it much more manageable. So that's changing my life. I don't know if anyone else can relate to it, but it's been great for me. So that's
You
what's changing my
know,
life.
I think what we can relate with is it's amazing how when you have one tool, how that can actually make a lot of things better. So that's great.
Exactly.
Good to hear. Mine is kind of small, but it's been really impactful to me. And that is I'm writing on my mirror in my bathroom with chalk markers. And I have a verse on
Nice.
there and some like people to pray for specific things. I've tried other ways to keep prayer requests at the forefront or like, writing verses on a little card and sticking it in my mirror, but there's something about it actually being on my mirror. I leave a little space to use, but the things around that, I see that, every day. And so it's a really good reminder of truth and of the people to be lifting up. So that's been changing my life lately. What about you, Eric?
Yeah, I think it might be an attempt at changing, but
Mm,
really trying to learn to slow my pace, and not
mm,
just my schedule,
mm,
but my spirit in that sense. And I think this is a lesson that comes from the students I've worked with over the years,
mm,
individuals with developmental disabilities who model that presence
mm.
in a way that I think the speed of our culture forgets. So just to try to be intentional about moving away from rush and more to just being in the
Yeah,
moment,
yeah.
as hard as that is amidst all the things we have to do. That's what I'm trying to learn,
Mm, mm.
particularly these days.
Yeah, yeah. That's great. Well, thanks again so much for being here, for sharing about these dimensions of belonging and for your work in this area.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Kian.
It was great to talk with Eric about this topic today.
Yes. Heather and I serve with Teach Beyond, a mission organization reaching the nations through education.
Want to learn more and get involved? Visit teachbeyond.org or follow us on social media.
To help more people find the podcast and hear about Teach Beyond, we'd love it if you would leave a rating or review and share the show with a friend. Be sure you're subscribed or following the show on the platform where you listen so you never miss an episode.
And as always, you can reach us at podcast@teachbeyond.org. We'll see you next week.